I'm coming!
Ow! My hair!
Oh God, sorry!
Doctor! Patient!
The harsh screech of the ER doors swung open as Dr. Lee Jun-seo stormed in, his medical coat billowing behind him like a flag of authority. His eyes were narrowed with irritation, and the white-hot fury that burned in his chest was evident in every step. He didn't even glance at the emergency nurses, who rushed to stabilize the latest patient. He had one target in mind. Annetta's back was turned to him, her hands steady as she applied pressure to the wound of a young boy who had been brought in after a car crash. She didn't flinch, didn't lose her cool. But she knew she always knew when Dr. Jun-seo was on the warpath. It wasn't his usual demeanor that made her senses tingle, but the sharpness in his voice, the coldness in his eyes. Something was coming, and Annetta was bracing herself. "Annetta!" Dr. Jun-seo barked, his voice cutting through the tension in the air. She didn't respond immediately, keeping her focus on the child's treatment. But she could feel him approaching, the weight of his presence like a storm cloud ready to burst. With a sharp movement, his hand reached out, grabbing a fistful of her hair, yanking her head back in a swift and brutal motion. Pain shot through her scalp as she staggered, struggling to regain her balance. The room fell deathly silent for a moment. Time seemed to freeze. Annetta's breath caught in her throat. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a brief moment, all she could hear was the pounding of her own pulse. This was it. The humiliation that had been building up over the years, the constant devaluation of her skills, the undermining of her authority, all of it had come to this brutal moment. But what Dr. Jun-seo didn't know was that someone else was watching someone who had been in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment. Han Seung-jun, the Mafia boss, the man who owned this city, the man who had seen everything from behind the tinted windows of the ER's observation room. His eyes locked on Dr. Jun-seo's aggressive gesture. His fingers, long and scarred, tightened around the phone he was holding. He made one call, no words, just a simple press of the dial button. Dr. Jun-seo still hadn't released Annetta's hair, and she winced, her body instinctively trying to pull away. The humiliation cut deeper than any physical pain. But then the silence in the room was shattered by a voice, a calm, collected voice that radiated power. Let go of her. It was a command, low and steady, but it held a weight that even the most arrogant surgeon couldn't ignore. Dr. Jun-seo froze, his grip on Annetta's hair faltering for the first time. He turned slowly, his jaw tight, only to meet the gaze of the one man whose mere presence made even the toughest men tremble. Han Seung-jun stood in the doorway of the ER, his dark suit impeccably tailored, his expression unreadable. But his eyes burned with a fire that made even Dr. Jun-seo's arrogance falter. Annetta didn't look at him, not yet. She couldn't, not with her pride hanging by a thread. But she could feel it, the storm brewing between them. A storm of vengeance. A storm of justice. Han Seung-jun made one more call. And as his voice drifted through the air like a promise, everything began to change. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. Before this moment in the ER, Annetta's life had been marked by the quiet rhythm of dedication. She was a nurse, yes, but in the eyes of many, she was little more than a background player in the grand hospital drama. They had underestimated her, but they didn't know the truth. Annetta was the heartbeat of this place, the glue that held it together. Without her steady hands and sharp mind, chaos would reign in the ER. She had earned her place here, had worked tirelessly to prove herself. But still they saw her as just a nurse, a quiet worker, someone easy to ignore. Annetta hadn't always been like this. Her mother had raised her to be strong in the face of adversity, but gentle with others. Growing up in a small town in the deep south, she'd learned early on that the world wasn't kind to people like her. She was an outsider, a black woman in a world that often treated her as less than. But she didn't care. Her worth wasn't defined by the prejudices around her. But here, in Seoul, things had been different. The people she worked with saw her skills. At least, most of them did. There were always exceptions. And Dr. Lee Jun-seo was one of those exceptions. It wasn't the first time he'd humiliated her. There had been countless moments where he belittled her in front of patients, doubted her decisions in meetings, and openly questioned her abilities in front of the medical staff. But this was different. This wasn't just an insult. This was a violation of her very humanity. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Her colleagues, the ones who respected her, watched, but none of them intervened. They knew better than to get involved. Dr. Jun-seo was the chief surgeon. His word was law in this hospital, and no one wanted to risk their career by challenging him, especially over a nurse. But Annetta wasn't like the others. She wasn't about to let this slide. She had worked too hard, fought too many battles to let one man define her. And that's when Han Seung-jun appeared. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't even someone who was supposed to be in the hospital. But when you controlled the entire medical district of the city, when you had more power than most could even fathom, you didn't need an invitation to show up. He wasn't like anyone Annetta had ever met. Cold, calculating, with a presence that demanded attention. Han Seung-jun wasn't just the mafia boss, he was a symbol of everything Annetta had fought against. Power, wealth, and corruption. But there was something about him that intrigued her. Not the kind of intrigue that made her heart race with desire, but the kind of intrigue that made her want to understand him. What made a man like him tick? What drove someone so dangerous to act the way he did? His presence in the ER that day wasn't by chance. He had been watching her. From the moment she stepped into that hospital, he had taken an interest in her. It wasn't that he was in love with her, not yet, anyway. It was something far deeper, far more intense. Han Seung-jun wasn't the type to let things go. And when he saw Annetta quiet, poised, and far more capable than anyone gave her credit, for something inside him shifted. He had his reasons for being in Seoul, reasons that had nothing to do with her. But now, seeing what happened in the ER, everything had changed. He wasn't going to stand by while someone like Dr. Jun-seo destroyed someone like Annetta. She was a woman who had been beaten down, her worth dismissed, yet she stood strong in the face of it. She didn't know it yet, but she was exactly the kind of person he respected. Annetta, however, didn't want his help. She didn't want anyone's help. She had never been the type to rely on others. She had learned the hard way that the only person you could depend on was yourself. She didn't need a mafia boss to come in and fix her problems. No, she wanted justice. She wanted the system to recognize her worth, to stop seeing her as just a nurse and start seeing her as the woman she was, competent, fierce, and capable of standing up for herself. The wheels were already in motion. The call Han Seung-jun made had set off a chain reaction that neither of them could have predicted. There was no going back now. The hospital was going to have to deal with what happened in the ER. And so would Dr. Jun-seo. But it wouldn't be easy. It wasn't just a matter of one phone call or one angry confrontation. No, this was a war. A silent war, fought in courtrooms and back rooms, in offices where billionaires and corrupt officials hid their dirty secrets. And somehow, Annetta would be right in the middle of it. She wasn't afraid. Not of them, not of the system, not of anything. She had already survived too much to back down now. But she was determined to do it on her own terms. No one was going to save her. She would save herself. The question was, would Han Seung-jun stand beside her, or would he be just another shadow in the fight for power? It had been 3 days since the incident in the ER, and Annetta had been holding her ground. The hospital administration had ignored her complaints, brushing them aside with empty apologies and promises of investigations. But everyone knew nothing would come of it. Not when Dr. Jun-seo held the strings to half the hospital's funding, not when his family's connections reached deep into the government. He was untouchable, and they knew it. But Annetta was no stranger to the feeling of being backed into a corner. She had spent her entire life in that position, constantly having to prove her worth in a world that refused to see her. So, she wasn't surprised when the letter arrived, but she was far from prepared for what it meant. The envelope was thick, the seal on it unmistakable. It wasn't from the hospital. It wasn't from any official body she recognized. It was from a law firm, one she had never heard of, but one that was clearly connected to something bigger. The letter inside was short, cold, and as she read it, a chill ran down her spine. We are writing to inform you that Dr. Lee Jun-seo has filed a formal complaint against you. The charges are serious, and we have evidence that suggests you have been negligent in your duties as a nurse. We are requesting your immediate suspension pending further investigation. Please report to the administration office at 9 a.m. tomorrow for a hearing. Annetta's hands shook as she finished reading the letter, but it wasn't from fear. No, it was the fire of betrayal burning in her chest. This was it. This was what she had been expecting all along. They were weaponizing the system against her, turning her quiet competence into a weakness, twisting every action to suit their narrative. She knew that the charges were fabricated. She hadn't made a mistake. She hadn't been negligent. But they didn't care about the truth. They only cared about their power, and Dr. Jun-seo would use his influence to ruin her if he could. But as she stared at the letter, something else caught her eye. It was a note in the margin, a simple phrase written in neat, deliberate handwriting. "I'll be at the hearing. Don't be afraid." Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't recognize the handwriting, but the message was clear. Someone was on her side. Someone powerful. She folded the letter carefully, slipped it into her bag, and took a deep breath. She wasn't going to let them break her. No, she was going to fight back. But she couldn't do it alone. Han Seung-jun had been watching. He had seen the humiliation. He had seen the way the system would turn on her. He had made his choice. She could feel it in the air. She wasn't sure if he had any real interest in helping her, or if this was all just part of his own twisted game, but he had made it clear that he wasn't going to let her be destroyed. At 9 a.m. sharp the next morning, Annetta walked into the hospital administration office, her back straight and her mind focused. She had expected the usual cold reception, the condescending smiles from the staff who knew she was about to be hung out to dry. But what she hadn't expected was Han Seung-jun to be sitting there, calm and collected, his dark eyes fixed on her with a look that sent a shiver down her spine. Dr. Jun-seo was there, too, sitting at the head of the table with a smug expression that made Annetta's blood boil. The moment he saw her, his lips curled into a smirk, as though he had already won. But before she could sit down, Han Seung-jun spoke, his voice smooth, authoritative, and full of quiet menace. "I'll be representing Miss Annetta today," he said, his gaze never leaving Dr. Jun-seo's face. "And if anyone here thinks they can bring charges against her, I suggest you reconsider." The silence in the room was deafening. Dr. Jun-seo's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Han Seung-jun's presence was like a thunderstorm, filling the room with an electric tension that made everyone uncomfortable. Even the hospital administrators, usually so smug and confident, seemed to shrink in his presence. Annetta sat down slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't expected him to show up at all, let alone stand beside her like this. It was unexpected. It was dangerous. And it was exactly what she needed. For the first time since that humiliating moment in the ER, she felt a glimmer of hope. But this wasn't just about winning in court. This wasn't about proving Dr. Jun-seo wrong. This was about something deeper. Something that could destroy both of them if they weren't careful. The hearing began in the cold, sterile room of the administration office, the air thick with tension. Han Seung-jun, still a shadow in the background, remained silent, his presence looming like a silent storm ready to unleash. Annetta, her heart racing but her resolve unwavering, sat at the table with him. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she wasn't alone. But as the meeting progressed, the truth became painfully clear. This was never about a simple dispute between a doctor and a nurse. The charges against her were carefully orchestrated, with evidence meticulously fabricated to destroy her career. Dr. Jun-seo's smirk never wavered as he presented his evidence, a string of accusations about her supposed negligence, all of them vague and unfounded, but damning enough to make any onlooker question her competence. Annetta's pulse quickened as she listened to the lies unfold in front of her. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in on her, suffocating her with the weight of the injustice she was facing. The hospital's administrators, all with their hidden agendas, nodded along, giving the impression that they were on Dr. Jun-seo's side, as if this were all part of a routine game, one where they held all the cards. But Han Seung-jun wasn't fooled. From the moment Dr. Jun-seo had made his move, he had seen through the ruse. This wasn't just about one woman's dignity, it was about control, power, and those who wielded it. As the hearing dragged on, Han Seung-jun's silence remained deafening. He didn't need to speak. His presence was enough. With every subtle glance he shot at Dr. Jun-seo, with every quiet shift of his gaze toward the administrators, he made it clear that there was more to this story than anyone realized. Annetta was no longer just a nurse. She was a symbol of resistance, and Han Seung-jun had made it his mission to make sure that no one would ever forget it. Then, just as Dr. Jun-seo's lawyer began to wrap up their case, Han Seung-jun stood, a slow, deliberate movement that caught everyone's attention. All eyes turned toward him, and the tension in the room seemed to snap. "I've seen enough," he said, his voice low and commanding. The silence that followed was suffocating, and for a brief moment, Annetta thought she had imagined the entire situation. But no, he was speaking. He was taking control. "I have evidence of my own," Han Seung-jun continued, his eyes cutting through the room like a knife. "I know what you've all been hiding, and I know exactly how far you've gone to manipulate the system in your favor." At the mention of evidence, the room went quiet. The administrators exchanged uneasy glances. Dr. Jun-seo's confidence faltered for just a split second, a mere crack in his armor, but it was enough to signal that the tides were turning. Han Seung-jun reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folder thick, official, and stamped with the kind of authority that couldn't be ignored. With a smooth motion, he slid the folder across the table to the administrators. "Open it," he instructed. Annetta's heart beat faster as they flipped through the pages, her mind racing. What could he possibly have? What kind of evidence could he be gathered in such a short amount of time? It didn't take long for the truth to become clear. The folder contained a series of documents, emails, and testimonies all linking Dr. Jun-seo to a series of illegal activities. Embezzlement, fraud, tampering with patient records. The documents were precise, detailing how he had been skimming money from the hospital's funds, falsifying records to cover up his mistakes, and even bribing officials to protect his position. But that wasn't all. There, in black and white, was a note from one of the hospital's board members, someone who had been complicit in covering up the corruption. A note that hinted at the possibility of Annetta being framed. It was no accident that she had been targeted. She was a threat to everything Dr. Jun-seo had built, and her downfall would solidify his control. Annetta's hands trembled as she looked at the evidence, her mind struggling to comprehend the depth of the conspiracy. She had thought she was fighting against one man's cruelty. But this was bigger. Far bigger. This was a network of lies, deceit, and corruption, all wrapped up in the guise of the hospital's elite. They had been operating in the shadows for years, and she had just scratched the surface. The shock of it all was almost too much to bear. But there was no turning back now. Han Seung-jun had given her the ammunition she needed, and now, the war was no longer just about one doctor's abuse of power. This was about something far more dangerous, exposing the system that allowed men like Dr. Jun-seo to thrive and making sure the truth came to light. Annetta's heart raced as she looked at Han Seung-jun. For a moment, she wasn't sure what he wanted. Was this just part of his game, his way of gaining control over the city's elite? Or was he truly on her side, willing to risk everything for justice? But before she could ask, he spoke again, his voice cold and determined. This is just the beginning. And with that, everything changed. The days following the shocking revelation at the hearing were a blur of activity, emotions, and the overwhelming sense that something much bigger than they had originally anticipated was unfolding. Han Seung-jun's involvement in the fight for Annetta's justice had shifted the entire playing field, and what had seemed like a lone battle was now becoming a full-scale war. The evidence Han had presented in the meeting was enough to halt the hospital's initial plans to suspend Annetta. The administrators were reeling from the truth that had been thrust into the light, but they were too entrenched in their own corruption to back down quietly. They began playing defense, calling for their own investigations, claiming that the evidence against Dr. Jun-seo was fabricated, that someone was out to destroy the hospital's reputation. But Annetta wasn't listening to their excuses. She had made it clear in the meeting that she wasn't interested in their apologies or their cover-ups. She wanted justice, real justice. And she knew it wouldn't come easily. What she didn't expect, however, was that the one person she thought she could trust, the one person who had been by her side through it all, would betray her. It happened on a Wednesday evening, the day after the hearing. Annetta had just finished her shift at the hospital and was heading to the cafe where she and Han Seung-jun had agreed to meet. The coffee shop was quiet, the soft murmur of voices providing a sense of calm before the storm. She felt the weight of everything pressing on her chest, the hospital's resistance, the pressure of fighting against a system so deeply corrupted, and the questions swirling in her mind about Han Seung-jun's true motives. Was he really on her side? Or was she just another pawn in his game? As she walked through the door, her eyes immediately locked on Han Seung-jun sitting at a corner table, his usual demeanor calm, his expression unreadable. But something was off tonight. There was an edge to his posture, a subtle shift in his energy that made Annetta pause for a moment. He gestured for her to sit, but she hesitated for just a second longer, as if some quiet instinct was telling her something wasn't right. The moment she sat down, he spoke. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice smooth and almost too calm, "about how we're going to take down Jun-seo." Annetta listened carefully, her mind sharp as ever. She was eager for the next step, for the plan that would finally bring justice. But before she could respond, Han Seung-jun's next words hit her like a punch to the gut. "I've made arrangements for you to leave Seoul," he said, his gaze never wavering. "Things are going to get more complicated. The hospital will do whatever it takes to discredit you. It's better for you to step away before it all goes too far." Annetta blinked, her heart dropping into her stomach. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly despite herself. I'm not leaving. I'm not running away from this fight. Han Seung-jun's expression didn't change. It's not about running. It's about surviving. You're too valuable to risk. I'll make sure the charges are dropped, but you need to get out of here. Leave before it gets worse. Her pulse was pounding now, the words slipping through her mind like a fog she couldn't shake. You want me to run? To just disappear? He nodded slowly, his eyes darkening. It's the only way. Annetta couldn't breathe for a moment, the walls of the cafe closing in on her. She had never expected this. She had trusted him. More than that, she had let herself believe that, for the first time in her life, someone had her back. But now it felt like a cruel joke. The man who had promised to fight for justice to help her expose the corruption that had nearly destroyed her was telling her to run. To leave everything behind. Her voice came out in a tight whisper. You're not going to help me. You're helping them. The words hit the table like a slap. Han Seung-jun's face remained unreadable, but Annetta could see the smallest flicker of something in his eyes. Guilt? Regret? She couldn't be sure. I'm trying to protect you, he said, his voice a shade softer. This fight isn't just about you. It's about power. You can't win this alone. You need to think about the bigger picture. Annetta stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She felt a sharp pain in her chest, the betrayal cutting deeper than anything she'd experienced. She had thought he understood her. Thought he'd seen her for the woman she was, not just some pawn in his world of games. Don't tell me what I need, she spat, her voice trembling with anger. I'm not going anywhere, and I sure as hell won't run from this. Before he could respond, she turned and stormed out of the cafe, her heart pounding in her ears. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: confusion, anger, betrayal. She had put her trust in him, but now it felt like she had been nothing more than another piece in his plan. As she walked through the streets of Seoul, her thoughts raced. Han Seung-jun had played his hand, but now Annetta knew one thing for certain. She wasn't just going to be a victim in this story. If anyone was going to bring Dr. Jun-seo down, it was going to be her, and she would do it her way, no matter what. The war had only just begun. The days after the confrontation at the cafe felt like a fog to Annetta. She had thought she was prepared for the fight. She had believed, with all her heart, that she was ready to take on a corrupt system, a man like Dr. Jun-seo, and even the looming shadow of Han Seung-jun. But what she had failed to anticipate was the overwhelming weight of it all. The world she had once trusted, the system she had relied on to protect her, was crumbling beneath her feet, and there was no escape. The charges against her weren't just accusations anymore. They had become a full-on campaign to destroy her. The media had caught wind of the scandal, spinning their own twisted narrative, one that painted her as the villain, as the nurse who had deliberately harmed her patients. It was all lies, and yet the world had bought into it. Friends she had once trusted turned their backs, whispering behind closed doors, questioning her every move. The hospital had turned into a battleground where every glance felt like an accusation. No one believed her anymore. And then there was the court case. Every legal battle felt like another mountain she couldn't climb. Every time she thought she had a chance to make her case, the system seemed to bend against her. Han Seung-jun's promises of protection had fallen to dust, his silence deafening. She hadn't seen him in days, and every time she tried to reach out, there was no answer. It was as if he had vanished from her life, leaving her to face everything alone. The worst part? It was the waiting. The endless waiting for the other shoe to drop. She knew Dr. Jun-seo wasn't done with her yet. The evidence he had manipulated, the lies he had spread, the connections he wielded in the court system, it was all coming for her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Annetta sat in the dimly lit apartment she had rented after the hospital forced her to take a leave of absence. The place felt empty, cold, despite the warmth of the evening sun filtering through the blinds. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt at peace. Every corner of her life seemed to have been infiltrated by fear and doubt. She had always prided herself on being strong, on handling every challenge that came her way. But now she wasn't so sure. Her phone buzzed suddenly, the screen lighting up with an unfamiliar number. Her heart skipped a beat, but she hesitated before answering. Could it be Han Seung-jun? Could it be another empty promise? Or was it yet another piece of bad news? Taking a deep breath, she swiped to answer. Annetta. Her heart dropped. The voice on the other end was unmistakable, cold, and dangerous. I warned you, Dr. Jun-seo's voice crackled through the phone. I told you to stay in your place. And now look at you. You think you can take me down? Think you can win against the system I built? Annetta's blood ran cold, but she refused to back down. She clenched her fist, her knuckles white as she gripped the phone tighter. "You're nothing but a coward hiding behind your lies," she spat back, her voice trembling with defiance. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm not running. You'll regret this." Dr. Jun-seo's laugh echoed through the line, hollow and mocking. "You think it's over? You think you've won? Let me remind you, Annetta, it's just beginning." And with that, the line went dead. Annetta's heart raced in her chest as the weight of his words hit her. He wasn't done. He was just getting started. The war was far from over, and she was alone in the trenches. Hours passed, and her mind continued to spiral into darkness. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. All she could do was replay the conversation in her head, hear his mocking voice echoing in her ears. She had no allies left. No friends. No backup. The system was against her, and she had no way out. The knock at her door came like a sudden, unexpected thunderclap. She didn't move at first, frozen in place. Who could it be? Could it be someone from the hospital? The authorities? When she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. Standing there, tall and silent, was Han Seung-jun. He was just as she remembered, the same dark eyes, the same stoic expression. But there was something different about him now. The weight of everything they had been through seemed to hang on his shoulders, and there was a weariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Why didn't you answer my calls?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The words came out before she could stop them, the hurt in her chest making it hard to breathe. Han Seung-jun didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped into the apartment, his presence filling the space. He looked at her with a sense of finality in his eyes, like he had made a decision, one that would change everything. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low, raw. "I should have told you sooner. I never wanted you to feel abandoned, but I couldn't risk it. I couldn't risk you getting involved any further. It's too dangerous." Annetta shook her head, her tears welling up. "You think I'm afraid of danger? You think I'm afraid of you?" "No," Han Seung-jun replied, his eyes softening for the first time since they'd met. "But I've made mistakes, and I don't want you to pay for them." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope, sliding it into her hand. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, revealing the most unexpected thing she could have imagined, a plane ticket. "Leave Seoul," he said. "I'll make sure you're safe. You don't have to fight this anymore." Annetta looked at him, the weight of his offer heavy in the air between them. She had wanted to believe in him, wanted to believe that, despite everything, there was more to him than the dangerous man who had walked into her life. But now, faced with the ticket, the symbol of his solution, everything felt like a betrayal. The tears that had been threatening to fall finally escaped, and she closed her eyes. She had come too far to leave now, to walk away. She had fought for justice, fought for the truth, and she wasn't going to back down because it was inconvenient or dangerous. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered, her voice fierce, determined. "Not now. Not ever." The days following Han Seung-jun's offer to leave the city were heavy. Annetta hadn't touched the plane ticket he had given her. It sat on her kitchen table, a reminder of the crossroads she was facing, the easy way out, or the fight that would define her. She had spent nights staring at it, her mind racing with the possibilities. She could leave. She could disappear, start over in a new city, a new life. No more fear. No more endless battles. But then, every time she thought about walking away, her mind returned to the same thought. How could she? She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the truth. She was fighting for every person who had ever been wronged, for every woman, every nurse who had been silenced, for every victim of the corrupt system that had taken root in the hospital. And for the first time, she realized that this fight wasn't just about her anymore. It was bigger than that. Annetta had always prided herself on being independent, on being strong. But she had to admit she couldn't do this alone. She had already learned that much. The system was too powerful. The hospital too entrenched in its corruption. But if she wanted to win, she needed to stop fighting the wrong battle. She needed the truth. The one thing that could change everything. And so that morning, as the sun barely peeked over the horizon, Annetta made her decision. She wasn't leaving. She wasn't running. She was going to take this fight to its heart and expose the corruption once and for all. The first step, she knew, was the hospital's records. The same records that Dr. Jun-seo had tampered with. The ones that had been used to frame her. The ones that held the key to everything. She had to get into the files, had to dig deeper, find the truth that no one else had dared to look for. Annetta's hands were steady as she picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in weeks. It was a name she had never expected to reach out to, but it was the only option she had left. The phone rang twice before the voice on the other end picked up. "It's time," Annetta said quietly. "I need your help." There was a pause. The voice on the other end was hesitant, but there was no mistaking the determination in it. "I'll meet you at the hospital in an hour," Han Seung-jun replied. "We'll do this your way." As Annetta arrived at the hospital, she didn't feel fear. She didn't feel the weight of the world on her shoulders. She was focused. Her purpose was clear. She was ready for whatever came next. The hospital was as cold and sterile as ever. The bustling corridors, the constant beeping of machines, they all felt like a distant hum now, a sound that faded into the background as she walked through the familiar hallways. She knew where she was headed, to the records room. But she had to be careful. Every step she took felt like it was being watched. She had learned the hard way that nothing at the hospital was as it seemed. There were eyes everywhere, and the last thing she wanted was to tip off Dr. Jun-seo or his team that she was onto something. She couldn't afford to make any mistakes. As she entered the records room, Han Seung-jun was already there, his back to her as he rifled through the files. The room was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights casting long shadows across the rows of patient records. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of secrets waiting to be uncovered. "Do you know what you're looking for?" Han Seung-jun asked, his voice low, but not without an edge of curiosity. Annetta nodded, pulling a file from a shelf at the back of the room. It was the one she had been searching for, the one that had the answers she needed. She opened it slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, the pages were full of handwritten notes, all signed by Dr. Jun-seo. But there, at the bottom of the last page, was a signature she hadn't expected. Han Seung-jun. She blinked, her breath catching. She hadn't seen it at first, buried beneath the layers of information that Dr. Jun-seo had worked so hard to hide. But there it was, unmistakable. Han Seung-jun's name. "Why is your name on this?" Annetta asked, her voice tight with suspicion. Han Seung-jun's face remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Something raw, something that spoke of long-buried truths. "I was protecting you," he said simply. "I made sure the records were safe. I knew you'd come for them eventually." Annetta felt her chest tighten. The anger and frustration she had been holding back, the questions she had been too afraid to ask, all came rushing to the surface. She had trusted him. She had thought he was playing a game, that he had been manipulating her just like everyone else. But now she realized he had been trying to help her all along. "You knew I would find this," she said softly, almost to herself. Han Seung-jun nodded. "I did. I wanted to be sure you had the truth. I couldn't tell you everything. It was too dangerous. But you've always had the strength to handle it." Annetta's heart ached with a mixture of confusion and relief. She had been so close to giving up, so close to walking away from everything. But this was the breakthrough she had needed, the final piece of the puzzle. The truth was right in front of her, and now she had the power to use it. To take down Dr. Jun-seo. To expose the corruption that had almost destroyed her. And this time, she wouldn't do it alone. The moment of truth had arrived. Annetta and Han Seung-jun stood in the quiet, dimly lit corridor of the hospital. The silence around them was suffocating. Every step they took felt deliberate, the weight of the secrets they carried pressing heavily on their shoulders. There was no going back now. They had the evidence, the files, the truth. The final showdown with Dr. Jun-seo was inevitable. But the question loomed over them both. Would this be the end of the battle, or the beginning of something even darker? They moved quickly, silently, toward the heart of the hospital, Dr. Jun-seo's office. They had already gathered everything they needed. The corruption, the lies, the manipulation. It was all in the files. All of it could bring him down. But Annetta knew that winning would never be that simple. There would be consequences. And Dr. Jun-seo was not a man who took defeat lightly. Inside the office, the walls were adorned with awards and certificates, a stark contrast to the man who had earned them. His reputation was built on his cold precision, his calculated charm, and his willingness to destroy anyone who stood in his way. And now, in the face of the evidence they held, he would either break or lash out. Han Seung-jun pushed the door open with ease, his calm presence barely disturbing the air in the room. Dr. Jun-seo looked up, his expression unreadable, the faintest flicker of surprise crossing his face. But it was quickly replaced by something colder, a subtle, mocking smile. "I knew you'd come," Dr. Jun-seo said, his voice dripping with venom. "But you're too late. You can't win this, Annetta. You never could." Annetta stood tall, her back straight, her hands clenched by her sides. There was no fear in her eyes, no hesitation. She had nothing left to lose. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about justice. It was about putting an end to the system that had allowed men like him to thrive. "I'm not here to win, Dr. Jun-seo," Annetta said, her voice steady and unwavering. "I'm here to expose you for what you are." She slid the files across the desk toward him, the weight of their contents heavy in the air. Dr. Jun-seo's eyes flicked down to the papers, his expression shifting from smugness to something far darker. He didn't say a word, but his hands trembled ever so slightly as he reached for the files. As he flipped through the pages, his face slowly drained of color. The evidence was undeniable. Every lie he had told, every manipulation he had orchestrated, was right there in front of him. But instead of panic, a twisted grin spread across his face. "You think this will stop me?" he sneered. "You think exposing me will change anything? You're just a nurse. You've always been just a nurse." Annetta felt her blood boil at his words. He had underestimated her once again. She was no longer just the quiet nurse who kept the ER running. She was the woman who would bring him down. She had already won. The evidence spoke for itself. But there was still one final piece of the puzzle that hadn't been revealed. The piece that would make sure Dr. Jun-seo never hurt anyone again. Han Seung-jun stepped forward, his eyes locked onto Dr. Jun-seo's. The air seemed to crackle with tension, a storm waiting to break. "You've underestimated her for the last time," Han Seung-jun said, his voice cold, each word like a dagger. "You're not just dealing with a nurse anymore. You're dealing with the truth. And the truth always comes out." The door slammed open behind them, and the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Annetta's heart raced as she turned, but it wasn't the hospital security or the police. It was something far more unexpected. The head of the hospital's board of directors, the man who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes, stepped into the room, his face pale with fear. He had been in on the scheme from the beginning. He had helped Dr. Jun-seo cover up his actions, helped him frame Annetta, and kept the corruption going. But now, seeing the files on the desk and the weight of the truth hanging over them all, he knew that his time was up. I didn't know what you were doing," the board member stammered, his voice trembling. I thought we could keep it under wraps. Please don't." "Enough," Han Seung-jun interrupted, his voice filled with authority. "It's too late for apologies. You've been complicit in every lie, every death. You'll pay for this. All of you." The board member's face twisted with panic, but before he could speak again, the door opened once more, and the police entered the room. Their uniforms gleamed under the fluorescent lights, their faces determined. Annetta felt a wave of relief wash over her. The cavalry had arrived. The truth had been exposed, and justice would be served. As the police handcuffed Dr. Jun-seo and the board member, Annetta felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't over yet, there would still be battles to fight, still scars to heal, but the war was over. The corruption had been torn down, and those responsible were finally facing the consequences of their actions. But there was one final thing Annetta needed to do. She turned to Han Seung-jun, who had been standing silently at her side. Their eyes locked, and for the first time, she saw something in his gaze that made her heart skip a beat, something that wasn't cold or calculated. Something warm. "I didn't do this alone," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you." Han Seung-jun nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You didn't need me. You never did. You just needed to believe in yourself." In that moment, everything seemed to shift. The tension that had weighed them down for so long was gone, replaced by a sense of peace, of finality. The fight was over. And though the future was uncertain, Annetta knew one thing for sure. She was stronger than she had ever been. Weeks passed in a blur. The aftermath of the court case was far from easy. Dr. Jun-seo had been arrested, tried, and convicted for his crimes, and the hospital's corrupt leadership had been dismantled piece by piece. The news was everywhere. The once untouchable chief surgeon brought to justice, the hospital's shady dealings exposed for all to see. But for Annetta, the victory felt bittersweet. She had won, yes, but at what cost? The emotional toll of the fight had been heavier than she could have ever imagined. The bruises from the public humiliation, the accusations, and the constant scrutiny had left their marks. She had spent so long fighting alone, convinced that justice could only come through sheer willpower, through doing everything herself. But now, standing in the aftermath of it all, she realized that she hadn't done it alone. She had never truly been alone. Han Seung-jun's presence, despite the twists and turns of their relationship, had been a constant. He had stood beside her when no one else would, even when it seemed like there was no hope left. And despite everything that had happened between them, despite the secrets and betrayals, she knew now that he had been her ally in more ways than one. She sat in the small cafe they had visited countless times during their battle, the warmth of the room a stark contrast to the cold, sterile corridors of the hospital. The sound of soft conversation and clinking coffee cups surrounded her, but she barely noticed. Her focus was on the man sitting across from her, his gaze as steady and sure as always. Han Seung-jun wasn't the man he had been when they first met. The cold, calculating persona had softened, revealing the complexity beneath. He had his own demons, his own battles, but in the end, he had chosen to fight for the truth for her. And she had chosen to trust him despite the risk. "You've come a long way," he said quietly, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable warmth in it now, a tenderness that had been absent before. Annetta smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in months. "We both have." For the first time in a long time, Annetta felt free. The weight of the hospital's corruption, the fear of being erased, was finally gone. She wasn't just the nurse anymore. She was Annetta, a woman who had faced insurmountable odds and come out stronger. She had stood up for what was right, and now she had nothing to fear. The future wasn't certain. The journey ahead would undoubtedly come with its own challenges, its own obstacles. But for the first time, Annetta was ready. She was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that she had the strength to handle it. Han Seung-jun reached across the table, his fingers brushing lightly against hers. There was no need for grand gestures, no need for promises. They both knew the unspoken truth, that the connection between them was real. And that, despite everything they had been through, they had found something worth holding on to. "I'm not going anywhere," he said softly, his eyes locking with hers. "Not now. Not ever." Annetta's heart fluttered in her chest. She didn't need grand words. She didn't need a dramatic declaration. She simply needed to know that she wasn't alone anymore. And in that moment, as they sat together, hands intertwined, she knew that she had found something worth fighting for. With everything behind them, the hospital's reign of corruption finally shattered, and justice served. Annetta had found peace in herself, in the truth, and in the unexpected bond she had forged with Han Seung-jun. And as they walked out of the cafe, stepping into the bright sunlight of a new day, she couldn't help but feel a quiet hope settle within her. It wasn't the end of her story, it was just the beginning. Thank you for following Annetta and Han Seung-jun's journey from pain to justice. If you've enjoyed this story, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's discuss. And remember, if you liked this story, there's always more coming your way. If you haven't already, click subscribe so you don't miss a single one of our incredible stories. Tomorrow, we've got something even crazier waiting for you. You won't want to miss it. Thank you for watching this story to the end.